Hey everyone, this is Sal Silvester. I'm the author of Unite, the 4 Mindset Shifts for Senior Leaders and the founder of Coachmetrix. Today on Dov Baron's show, we're going to talk about what great leaders do, some of the characteristics it takes to be a great leader, some of the areas to effectively transition into senior leadership, and a whole bunch more unique and interesting secrets about leadership. Stay tuned for more.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron, is the founder of FullMontyLeadership.com. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. I'm your host, Dov Baron, the founder of Full Monty Leadership, and I'm here to assist you tapping into your deep greatness so you can reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives, part of the Full Monty interview series, where today we're taking an insider look at the need for executive coaching, training, and development. Is it something for all leaders? And if so, how can you measure the results? If you're a new listener, new viewer, thank you for joining us. Strap yourself in, we're about to go full Monty. If you're a regular, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. We are sincerely appreciative of that. And listen, we're also grateful to Inc.com for making us the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. So thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. And listen, we always need your help in staying relevant. So please get yourself over to iTunes, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. Please do it now. The more you do, the more you share it, the better it is. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. As a leader, whether you're a CEO, C-suite leader, sales leader, entrepreneur, leader in any capacity, you know that if you're going to get to the top and you're going to stay at the top of your game, you must be willing to grow and change. But that growth and change has to not just stay with you, it must be the whole team. The challenge becomes when you provide coaching and then the team members, take it, but do they make any meaningful changes? And how do you measure whether you were just wasting your resources? Well, stay tuned because our guest today is Sal Silvester. Sal Silvester is the founder and president of 5.12 Solution Consulting Group and Coachmetrix. Did I say that right? 512 Solutions Consulting Group and Coachmetrix. He is a blogger, keynote speaker, author of Ignite, the 4 Essential Rules for Emerging Leaders. The book reached #1 on Amazon's Movers and Shakers list. The second book in that series was called Unite, the 4 Mindset Shifts for Senior Leaders, was also on Amazon's bestseller list, followed by a collaboration with none other than Marshall Silver entitled Stakeholder Coaching, Centered Coaching. Working with teams and leaders is Sal's passion. He's an entrepreneur, and he's an executive and a team coach with a unique perspective that has nurtured him and the work that he's done through his experience of 25 years in the Army, as an Army officer, executive at Accenture, and the founder of 512 Solutions and Coachmetrix. Sal's Coachmetrix technology is the first of its kind that is changing how coaching and training measures the impact of leadership development. If you are listening to the podcast as opposed to seeing the podcast, you may be thinking that I'm going to introduce you to a guy with slick back, black greasy hair and a black suit and a black tie, a black shirt because his name is Sal Silvester and he's going to get you some concrete boots. But that's not who he is. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sal Silvester.
Awesome to be here. Thank you.
And the people who fear the mafiosa are now been settled down, so we know that that's not who you are. So welcome, man. It's good to have you here.
Hey, man, thank you. It's good to be here. I'm just honored to be on the show and look forward to good 45 minutes, an hour of fun together.
Well, that would be great. So let's go to the first thing, which is the thing I ballsed up, which is the name of your company, 512. Why 512?
So 512, and I know you've done some climbing in your time because I've heard some of your stories and keynotes. 512 is a rock climbing term, and technical climbing routes are rated on a scale of 5.0 to 5.15. And when you get to that level of 512, to me, it indicates world class. And it symbolizes the training and coaching that we deliver. And I happen to be passionate about rock climbing and ice climbing and mountaineering and anything related to the outdoors and climbing.
So for those who don't know, they don't know the relationship, but it's actually about saying, really, to be at the top of your game, you got to be at least 5'12", and that's not height, but as in you got to be at that standard.
Yeah, without a doubt, and not even just being at that standard, but more about like the mentality of how do you get to that standard. So, as an example, I don't climb at the 512 level, but I train and coach at the 512 level, and so it takes an amount of dedication. It takes an enormous amount of clarity of purpose, of self, and commitment to our clients, and that's really what the theme, the metaphor of it embodies. I think climbing is just a great metaphor for leadership.
I agree with you. I think it's a phenomenal metaphor. And one of the things I like about leadership, particularly in that metaphor, is it is climbing. It is not free climbing. You are not on your own. You know, I know because I did free climbing. It's a stupid sport. I know because I can actually say that because I fell. But, you know, climbing, when I'm asked about climbing, I say it's not a dangerous sport because you have safety lines, you have hooks, and you usually have a team with you. And that's the understanding of leadership is that you're not this solo guy. And we've been trained so much around leadership to think it's a solo gig. Talk to us a bit about, because, you know, I know you've done a lot of work with teams. Talk to us a little bit about that side because I want them to grasp that.
Yeah, you're right on in terms of that metaphor. I think the beautiful thing about climbing that relates directly to leadership and to teams is that combination of courage and vulnerability. And you talk a lot about this in Fiercely Loyal.
Yeah.
But there's an element when you're out climbing with somebody about just being vulnerable. I mean, your head might not be in the space. You may not be climbing as strong as you want. I'll give you an example. I went down to Ecuador to do some mountaineering with three buddies of mine from the mountain rescue team here in Boulder. And we got down there, we climbed a few peaks, and we went for the biggest one that we were trying to summit, Chimborazo. It's a 21,000 almost foot peak. And I bonked at 20,000 feet. And it's a very vulnerable thing to be able to admit a weakness or say, hey guys, I need help and I need to turn around. And it takes a lot of courage to be able to do that. And the same thing applies on our teams. We've really got to be able to create that environment as leaders where people can be vulnerable, where they can ask for help, they can offer help, they can have the courage to say, I'm sorry. And so there's that direct connection around vulnerability and courage.
But so often, I mean, you know this, you're younger than me, but any of us over 45, we were conditioned that it's not okay to show that weakness, to show vulnerability, to show any chink in the armor, and to turn around at 20,000 feet and say, I can't make the last 1,000. You know, in a leadership position feels like, you know, it's an identity crisis for many leaders.
Mm-hmm. It is, and that mentality has to change. It has to change from that old school command and control, top down, to being okay with being vulnerable, more inclusive. People want to feel valued, and you know what, Dob? There's nothing more powerful than when a CEO stands up in front of his or her people and says, "Hey, folks, this is what I'm working on."
Right.
Talk vulnerability, and then giving everybody else permission to also get better.
Yeah, I agree fully. So, you know, you and I both work with very senior individuals, so you probably bump into this too. So even though you just said what you said, that there's nothing more powerful than a leader saying, here's what I'm struggling with, here's what I'm working on. You no doubt bump into leaders who say, yeah, but that's not true for me, right? Or, yeah, but I'm going to retire in 5 years and I ain't not going down that road. Or, yeah, this is a passing phase of the new leadership thing, but, give it time and it'll all go back to command and control. How do you present to those guys? What do you say to those people who think it's something that's a passing phase and that they don't actually have to do? They don't have to do it.
Yeah. And I think the challenge with some of that is when people sort of are coming from that mentality, they often see other leaders who do operate under that model and who are successful. Exactly. And then there's this misattribution of, I see that success, or I've had success using that leadership style, and therefore I'm successful, instead of they're successful in spite of that. So to me, the biggest piece is helping the leaders see their impact. And one of the most powerful ways for leaders to be able to see that impact is by gathering information about the people who are impacted by their behaviors. So Absolutely. Sometimes we do that through a 360 process or through verbal and confidential interviews, because then when you hand the leader that data, that's not from me, the coach, but from other people, it's objective. Right. And then that gives them the reason or the potential reason to change.
Potential reason. It's very interesting because I think that as leaders, it's very easy to become egoic for any of us in that position because we have power, we have influence. And at the same time, it's one of the things I love about the human mind. As somebody who studies the human mind, love looking at is polarity. So we play this thing of having all this power and all this influence, but then tell ourselves, well, we don't really have any influence in the sense of, well, listen, I may have screamed at Bob at work, but that doesn't impact Bob's life. Yeah, it kind of does. And they don't get that. And I know you had a very personal experience of this, sitting at the dinner table with your dad and the family, where you got to really see the impact of leadership. Walk us through that story, because I read that and I thought, wow, that's something leaders need to understand.
Mm-hmm. I just remember growing up my entire childhood, my father would come home and talk about the old man. And the old man, you talk about days of command and control, ran this construction company in Connecticut. And my father would talk about what happened at work. And most of the time, it was when he was talking about the old man, the stories weren't very positive. They were about the negative impact that the old man was having on my father. And I could see how it wore him down, and the stress and the anxiety that he brought home with him every night. And then I think as I sort of grew in my career as a leader, I started to get that connection. Mm-hmm. When leader operates a certain way, whether it's positive, negative, those polarities, it doesn't just impact people in the workplace. It has a ripple effect out to everyone else that person touches. And an indication of how committed people are to their leader is, what do they talk about when they're sitting around the dinner tables at night talking about the person that they're working for?
Yeah. It's a fascinating piece that never ceases to amaze me, how little we really get the impact that we have. There's a story I've told before, but I just think it's worth it. And that I delivered a 3-day training. It was intense, and at the end of it, people are gracious and they stand around and they say thank you. And that's very nice. And I always like to ask an extra question, which is when people say thank you, I say for what? Because people are courteous. They'll say thank you, but it doesn't mean anything, and it certainly doesn't land for me. It hits the plexiglass, and I don't want it to. I want it to penetrate. So I say for what? And there was this one lady lined up, and she waited. And she said, thank you. And I said, may I ask you specifically for what? And she paused. She was wonderful. And she said, for my grandchildren. And I said, well, first of all, you don't look old enough to have grandchildren. And she said, well, I'm not, but that's my daughter over there. And she was in this training with us, and we were talking about deep greatness and finding your purpose and all the rest of it. And that's my daughter. She just got married, and they want to have children. She said, and what we've learned here today is change my relationship with my daughter will no doubt change my daughter's relationship with her own children and change my relationship with my grandchildren. Wow. Right? And at that moment, my eyes started to leak. I sprung a leak because it was at that moment I actually got that I was living my purpose, because it's not about, as leaders, it's not about those we serve directly in front of us. It's about the generations, the ripples, that may be family generations, but may just be generations as in the ripples of impact that we have. And that's what I love about what you're saying, Sal, that I think is so vitally important, is to recognize your leadership does not end in the boardroom or in the line of command, that it has a massive impact that goes out forever.
Without a doubt. I had a similar story. We're running a leadership development program with 12 high potential leaders at this high-tech company in Denver. And I was in a coaching session with 3 of them, and it's about a 500-person company. And I said, how many people do each of you impact here in the workplace? And between these 3 high potential leaders, about 50 people. So can you imagine these 3 leaders impact very directly 50 people in a 400 or 500 person company? They fundamentally have the ability to make a significant difference in that culture. But then again, think about that ripple effect to the families and the extended families. Most of the time when people are talking to us about the changes and the transformations that they've had, they're very personal. They come in to a program and they think they're going to learn skills, and they learn a lot of great skills. But the transformations are more about self-confidence and understanding their awareness and understanding their impact on other people. Very powerful. That has a massive ripple effect.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because I remember recently I was working, like I'd gone on to do an initial training for a company we were going to work with, and we do this one-day sort of education day. And at the end of it, we're sort of working out whether we're going to work with them, because we choose them as much as they choose us. We don't say yes to everybody who wants to work with us. And the founder said to me, what is the biggest result you've gotten? Oh, and I said, that's easy. Now, I know he was thinking I was going to say, we made this company $400 million or some crazy number. And I said, oh, that was easy. And he says, what? I said that every single member of the executive team came to us and said, this has changed my marriage. This has changed the way I parent. This has changed our relationships at home. This has made me a more loving dad or a more loving mom or a more open communicator with my wife. My relationship is better. And I sort of found out and I said, and we never, ever focused on family.
Yes.
But what we're doing is, listen, leadership starts here. It starts at the heart and the soul of the individual. And it's the responsibility to recognize that as that person, you are a broadcaster. And you are broadcasting not just directly, but indirectly. If you pass my house, as you walk past my front door, you can pick up my Wi-Fi. And if you have the password, it can impact you. Right? It's the same thing. We're all broadcasting as leaders, and we've got to take responsibility for that. And that is the tough place, because I think that this is where we get stuck. You provide this phenomenal coaching program and ways to measure, which is quite unique and phenomenal. I want to get into it. But understanding that piece, understanding this impact piece is vital, because unfortunately, leaders often look at bottom lines. And it's not, that in itself is not unfortunate, but they look exclusively at bottom lines. And they say, well, since I've been with the company, we've had a 5% growth. We've made an extra $1 million. We've, whatever it is. But that balance sheet doesn't deal with the impact of people. What do you say to those folks when they come back and say, well, listen, Sal, this is great. This is good shit, but we don't need it because, look, we're growing, we're doing great, we're making more profit. So where do you go with those folks?
Yeah, great question. We do 2 things. Number one, first of all, we put them in a therapeutic bind. Meaning, so let's take, the typical
evil person, you.
Yeah, right. The typical overly confident, maybe arrogant leader who's successful in spite of himself, not because of what he does or she. And what's most important typically to those leaders are results. And oftentimes what we'll do is we'll ask them that question, what's important to you? And they'll typically say something like results. We'll hold that up. And then we'll say, well, I'm also observing this, this, and this about you. What's the impact of that? And what they'll quickly see is that when they lead without a focus on relationships, it actually takes them longer to get what they want the most, which are the results. Right. Because people will tend to be compliant versus committed to that leader. So one, we help them see where their behaviors are out of alignment with what they want most, and it's actually taking them longer to get there. But two, we think great leadership is about results and relationships. And what we find in our work is that leaders tend to sort of lean one way or the other on these polarities. And for those leaders that are very highly focused on results, it's not about lowering those expectations or those standards, but it's about raising up the expectations around creating great relationships, being aware and present as you're communicating with others, connecting with people, having that soulful purpose, that authenticity as you're inspiring and motivating and getting connected with people. So when leaders do both, they actually get more of what they want the most, which are those profits and results.
However, the interesting thing is that I think that often we buy our own press. And what I mean by that is that I know I've had conversations with founders who actually believe they're good at relationship. And I look at them and I'm like, that's because, and you and I talked about this in our previous conversation, everybody's a sycophant. Everybody's sitting around as yes people because you're going to write their check. What are they going to tell you? Listen, you're a dick? I don't think so. You're going to write the check. So this is part of the challenge, is getting them to honestly look in the mirror rather than looking in the mirror through the rose-colored lenses they see themselves through versus the dark lenses they see everybody else through. Give our listeners, our viewers, some guidance around that, if you could, because I know that is even a CEO listening going, I can see that Bob does a great job, but he actually thinks he's good with people, but he's crap. And we're losing great people because of his lack of ability in the relational side.
Yeah. We call those people derailers. And typically they're great producers, whatever the production is, whether it's sales or, they might even be in law enforcement.
Right.
But there's this collateral damage. There's this wake that they leave behind of dead bodies. And it's more costly than the results that they're actually producing. So for that CEO or that senior leader that has a derailer on the team that is hesitating, number one, if you're hesitating because you're conflict avoidant, then you're actually costing your business more money. Mm-hmm. There's always a cost to conflict avoidance. But number two, you're impacting the great performers that are also on that team. And by the way, you're losing credibility as a leader because all of the other people around you are wondering why you aren't giving feedback and having those difficult discussions with that employee. So that derailing behavior, those derailers, people who are great producers, but they just undermine how a team functions and operates, is toxic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's... And so often, particularly in not such a large company, but in small or mid-sized companies, that, quote, derailer is kept in place because they produce. And so they do hit the hard numbers. And often a company is like, if we get rid of Fred, if we get rid of Susan, then we're going to lose this. And one of the things I say all the time is, if you just put them in a playing field amongst everybody else and you'd say, yeah, but they're performing 20% better than everybody else. And I go, how many other people is in the team? And they go 5. And I go, okay, they're 20%. What does that mean across here? So divided by the other 4, they all have to come up 5% in order to meet that 20%. And they go, yeah, go right. I say, here's the deal. Every one of those players is playing lower than 5%. because of this high performer, because of your derailer. Get rid of the derailer, and I promise you, you won't lose. You'll lose initially for a very brief period because it's unstabling, but then everybody else is like suddenly free because they're not living in that environment. And this is one of the things that people don't understand about the psychology of human beings, is that we are so receptive to our environments. And if we're put in a toxic environment, nobody plays well in that. Yeah. Nobody plays well. When you talk... Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, you talk a lot about purpose over profits, right? Yeah. Because when you've got that deep connection, that deep sense of purpose, the profits usually come, and you give some great examples in Fiercely Loyal, Patagonia, and others, right? Yeah. The profits come when there's that deep purpose, but when individual leaders have clarity of purpose, and when they see leadership as something more than just producing that results, when they see it as the ability to make a contribution to other people's lives, everything changes. Mm-hmm. And you may even find that they don't have the right people on their team at the moment. But when they get those right people in the right seats, then they get to spend less time motivating and managing and running the business.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you speak about in our last conversation you brought up, and I just thought it was so great, and I want our listeners, our viewers to get it. You talked about the distinction between right and smart versus aware.
Yeah. Well, it's funny when we think about working with senior leaders, we see some key distinctions, and most of them tend to be around mindset. Mm-hmm. And one of that first distinction is, do you want to be smart or aware? And it's the difference between relying on that technical expertise, relying on the technical competence that typically will get the leader that job, and developing that self-awareness so that you can stay in relationships, build relationships, and in senior leadership roles, especially when you've got competing priorities with your peers. Yeah. So it's a shift. At lower levels of leadership, leaders can often hide behind that technical competence. They can hide their leadership dysfunction. But when you start rising to that senior director, VP, senior VP role, and certainly higher, if that self-awareness doesn't come and isn't more important to you than being smart or being right, leaders start to really derail themselves at those levels.
Well, so you've done a lot of work with a lot of top people. What do you see that is the most common mistake with people who are transitioning? So they're going into a senior leadership position. What is the most common thing that you see them bumping up against all the time?
Yeah. Great question. There's a few things. Probably the first is just going right back to their comfort zone. So maybe you sort of grew up in the sales function and now you're running sales and service, or maybe you're stepping into a role as COO, and so you're running a larger function of the business. The tendency is for leaders to revert back to their technical comfort, especially in those more senior roles, as opposed to being able to step back and lead functions through other people. So that's probably one of the stickiest pieces that we will initially see at the earliest phases of that career transition. Mm-hmm.
So how do you get, what's one tip you would give them in that context?
Yeah, I think part of the mindset shift here is thinking more systemically about the business. So what has to change is a focus on the function to a focus on the enterprise. And really thinking about not just solving problems sort of vertically in the organization, but thinking about all of the systemic impacts of those issues with your peers, with those cross-functional areas of the business. So the shift becomes, how do I get the best results out of my function, to how do I start thinking like an enterprise leader?
So I want to go a little bit deeper with that, because that's pretty cool stuff. So let's imagine the person, because it's not natural to them, is saying, sounds good, but I don't know where to start.
Yeah.
Where do they start?
Peers. Well, two places. First, the self-awareness piece, to understand how you impact others, right? Because part of this is, how do I stay in conversation when I'm negotiating and collaborating with my peers who might have those competing priorities? But we spend so much time in leadership development, especially at lower levels of leadership, thinking about how do I become a great leader of my direct reports? And at senior leaders, a big part of the leadership effectiveness really comes from those cross-functional relationships. So building those relationships before you need to have those relationships, that is a great place to start.
Is that, I know how I would answer that, but I want to hear from your view. Do you see that as something that great leaders consistently do?
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. And they don't, they don't just do it when they have to, but they do it beyond that. So they're thinking about the enterprise, they're thinking about the business, they're thinking about where can I add value? And how do I build that network of people? How do I build my power base? How do I build that network of people that I can help make a contribution to? And, by the way, they may even be competing for the next senior level role, but they can put their own personal agendas and egos aside and do what's best for the business.
Yeah, that can have some challenges. It's like putting the ego to the side. I mean, we know these language now. We hear about it. We hear about transparency, but I fear that so much of it has become kind of cool jargon and often not fully stepped into yet. I mean, people talk about me being this very in-your-face leader, but, I don't know that I am. I'm just not willing to let you use it as jargon and say, I'm very authentic. And then I say, well, what does authentic mean? And, people think it means to be a certain way. No, authentic doesn't mean to be a certain way. Authentic means to be you, but to have compassion and to have empathy, not just, well, this is just who I am. I'm a dick. Yeah, that's not authenticity. That's dick.
Yeah. I call it the Popeye syndrome, meaning I am what I am.
Yeah, I am what I am.
Yeah,
That
I am what I
make you
am.
authentic. That makes you stuck.
Yeah, it's an inflexibility. It's a rigidity that just gets leaders in trouble. It will ultimately derail them in their careers, without a doubt. The Popeye syndrome.
You, like I said, you have your company, 512. You've got something that is very unusual in that you have a software for measuring the results, measuring the change from coaching. Any of us who are in the coaching world, it becomes somewhat at least allegorical that, let me tell you a story about how. Talk to us about what you've got that is, that was quite intriguing for me and wanting to have you on the show, to have people go, huh? You can do that?
Yeah, no, it's great question. Part of where our technology came from, Coachmetrix, is through some problems that we had and some holes that we had, gaps in our own program. So what we found is our work became more and more focused on these leadership behaviors, these tendencies that leaders have, taking already successful people and helping them make even more meaningful and measurable change. But the problem is we weren't measuring anything. We were just measuring reaction. We had these great surveys about our facilitators and coaches, but we didn't actually know if people were moving the needle. So that was the first gap.
Right.
The second gap we found in our program, we'd run these fantastic leadership development programs, and we'd ask leaders to identify the behaviors that they wanted to change and create these action plans. And when they were paper-based action plans, we found that there were always gaps between the action plan itself and having enough information or a solid enough action plan to drive that change. And in many cases, people didn't even put together an action plan.
Right.
And then we also saw this trend of moving to the cloud. So we wanted to create a platform that also allowed coaches to very easily get tools and resources in the cloud, because people don't carry around leadership development workbooks in the workplace. So we created Coachmetrix, and the overall purpose of the tool is to measure that behavior change. And we do that by enrolling what we call supporters into the leader's journey. So if Dob, you're a coachee in one of our programs, you might have 1 or 2 or 3 leadership behaviors that you're trying to change.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to surround you with the people who are impacted by your behaviors. It might be your direct reports. Maybe it's your manager. Maybe it's some of your peers. And then we ask them through our Coachmetrix technology to respond to pulse surveys throughout your leadership journey based on that action plan to see if you're actually moving the needle. And they're giving you feedback on how you've done in the last 30 to 60 days, and then ideas for the future. Marshall Goldsmith calls this feed forward. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that we're helping you change behavior, but we're also helping you change perception. And one of the challenges that leaders have in the workplace is changing other people's perception that they already have of that leader. They've worked with them for months or for years. They've got these preconceived notions. Without consistent follow-up and without seeking that feedback from those supporters, it's very rare that perception changes. Right. You can go and change a behavior in a moment, but changing someone else's perception about your behavior is much harder, I think. And so Coachmetrix helps change that behavior and also change the perception of that leader.
So there's 2 things there for me, which is this shift around perception, and I want to come to that, but also a thing that you and I talked about before, which is how do you facilitate honesty in that feedback? Because, we talked about it earlier, the sycophantic response, which is to say, I'm going to say you're better because you're my boss. So how do you get people to be really honest in that feedback?
Mm-hmm. I think part of this is creating that, if you will, psychological safety. So for that leader to verbally have an interaction with their supporters and say, listen, I'm working on X, Y, and Z, and I need your help. Will you give me ongoing feedback and feed forward? And then following up on that, let's say every 30 days, every 45 days, it gives people permission. And what we find with this methodology is that we not only impact the leader, but just like we talked about before, that ripple effect, we start seeing those supporters making behavioral changes too. So it starts with vulnerability, and the leader has to put it out there and just put it on the line. Hey, this is what I'm working on. I need some help.
Right. The perception piece that you brought up there, for me, is an interesting subject because there's a story I told years ago about a friend of mine walking down the main street in Vancouver. He was my training partner, he was my friend, we hung out all the time, and we bumped into somebody that we knew. That I didn't know my friend knew them, but I knew this person. So I said, hey, how you doing? And they were kind of like, hey, good to see you, Dov, and just gave my other friend, the nod, but that was it, and walked away. I was like, that was weird, okay, and I let it go. And a few days later, I saw the person that I'd bumped into, and I said, what was that about? There was some shit going on there. What was that? And he says, I can't believe you're friends with him. And I go, who? And he goes, and he says the guy's name, and I said, why not? And he goes, he's such an asshole. And he starts telling me about all these things about him. And I said, I don't know who you're talking about. And he says, you do. You were standing there. We were walking together. When I saw you, and I said, no, I don't know who you're talking about. And he goes, stop being a dick. Who are you? You know exactly who I'm talking about. I said, no, I don't. I don't have the perception you do. I don't know the dick. I don't know the bully. I don't know. Yeah. The guy I know is kind, caring, spiritual, funny, generous. I don't know that person. Now, the person he was talking about, because I found out later, was the person he'd gone to high school with. And the person I was friends with was 30 years old. So that perception shift is like unjamming this old image, particularly if you've had a dictatorial leader who is really working hard at becoming, transforming. That can be quite the perception shift.
Yeah, it's interesting. a few thoughts. I mean, I'm just so passionate about this side of leadership because it is difficult to change. I was working with a leadership team very recently, about a month ago. We were doing sort of a peer feedback exercise where all the leaders were giving each other feedback and feed forward about how they're performing. And the CEO twice stopped himself and said, I was going to give you this feedback, but then I realized it's not true anymore. And yeah, so number one, people have to be in coaching engagements. They have to be willing to let go of old perceptions. And that's part of the coaching that we'll do with supporters along the way. But number two, those perceptions don't change unless the leader goes back and lets people know that they're still working on that change.
Right.
Hey, you're working on this. And this doesn't happen once or twice. It has to happen consistently. And some of the data that's come out of Coachmetrix for us is that it might take 6 months or more for that self-perception to be aligned with other people's perceptions, so that the consistency of going back to people. Marshall Goldsmith has an article on this called Leadership as a Contact Sport, Harvard Business Review, and it lays out all the data behind this. But it's fascinating at how long it can take to change that perception. And without that consistent follow-up, perception of that leader typically doesn't change.
So with your Coachmetrix, is that something exclusive to your company? And is that something exclusive to your coaches? Or is that something that other coaches maybe are watching or listening and go, oh, that sounds cool. Can I get that?
Yeah, we re-architected it a couple of years ago and now sell it as a cloud tool for other coaches and trainers. And it's part of the way we want to make a bigger contribution to the coaching industry. So yeah, you can go out to coachmetrix.com and check it out. It's a subscription service, pretty inexpensive, and you can get on the platform and start with a free project with your own clients. So yes, it's available for other.
Fabulous.
And my hope is that we can sort of continue to elevate executive coaching. It's incredible how widely accepted it is now as a very positive intervention for successful people. It's not just for broken people.
No.
In fact, we work with very few broken people, if you will. And so we're elevating. What we hope to do is just continue to elevate the credibility of coaching, to be able to go beyond the anecdotal, I feel it, I know this leader changed, and have some evidence and proof that the leader actually has changed. And not from the perception of that leader, but from the perception of other people.
Those around them, yeah. So as we get closer towards the end of the program, I want to ask you, are you buying your own goods?
Oh, great question. I am buying my own goods. Our first core value as an organization is walk the talk.
Right.
And if I'm not coachable from my people, from the coaches and trainers that I work with, then I'm not worth a grain of shit, and neither is any other coach out there. So we do, and there's a few things that we do that I do personally. Number one, I've got a coach, and she helps me quite a bit with my business, but fundamentally, my business is a reflection of me, who I am as a person, yeah. Right? So right back to that purpose, authenticity, being extremely vulnerable. So I've got I have several development areas. One place that I'm working on is I can often hide behind humility and use it as a shield, if you will, and not sort of step up and assert for myself, assert for what I need, assert for my business. So that's a development area that I'm working on, and trying to find more significance, but doing it in a way that is really on purpose and really intentional. So we walk the talk. I walk the talk through reflection, through daily routines and habits and journaling and my own behavioral measurement and my own coach, 100 plus hours a year of personal development. It has to be. And one other area, Dob, that I'll touch on, I know we have to wrap up. This is incredibly fun and going so fast. I can't believe it. But a big development area for me was always this idea of comparing myself to other people.
Yes.
And I did that for a long time. And I used to compare myself to the executives that I was coaching.
Yeah, that is definitely one that shows up.
Yeah, and I always walked away sort of feeling very shitty about myself. And I started to make this transition to comparing myself to a vision that I have for myself instead of to other people. And I firmly believe that I can have it all, meaning I can have a great quality of life. I think I can have a great relationship with my 2 young boys and my wife. I've taken the last 4 Thursday mornings off to ski with my 4.5-year-old, and I'm telling every executive that I work with about it, and I'm damn proud of it. And I think I can be pretty damn financially successful. I already am. But we subscribe to this notion that we have to be a certain way, that we have to step into somebody else's image. And part of my own personal work in the last, especially several years, is getting rid of all that and just being myself and stepping into the person, the leader, and the husband and the father and the son that I want to be.
I think what you said there is profoundly important. It's something I emphasize in my work with my clients. It is nature. It is part of our being to naturally compare ourselves to others. But it doesn't mean you have to operate from there. That's going to come up is what I'm saying. It's just like, accept that that's the price of doing business. That's what's going to show up. Okay. But what you said, I think, is so vitally important. If you go, okay, I'm going to compare myself to this person I'm coaching or to this person who is my CEO or the person who is in my team, whatever it is. Just okay, that's going to happen. But then can you compare yourself to the vision of where you want to go, to the vision of who you're stepping up to be? And that is a summit you will never reach. And I think that's another thing to be important. And that's not, and people go, oh, that's so disheartening. No, not at all. Because this as a climber, there is 2 things with climbing. You've always been reaching for the next summit, but you've also got to pay attention to how far you've come. Because if you get to 20,000 feet and you go, oh, I didn't make it to the top, you made it 20,000 feet. And you've got to pay attention to that. Right?
Great. That target is always moving. Yeah.
Right. And this is one of the great challenges. And I'll be honest, total vulnerability. This is one I struggle with myself. Is that, I have this expectation of where I should be, which is different than vision of what I'm holding of myself. And I think this is where people make the mistake. They go, this is where I should be. No, what's the vision you're holding of yourself? Well, it's this. No, that's not your vision. What's the vision of yourself? Well, and then when we look at that, that's a much kinder, calmer place that's usually got a lot more compassion in it, whereas the should is compassionless. It's void of compassion. Over here, there's a ton of compassion. It's like, I'm patting myself on the back for the journey I've been on. Wow, it's pretty amazing. I got to 20,000 and I fell 2,000, but I survived. And I went back the month after, the year after, 10 years after, and climbed again. Amazing. So I love what you're saying there about holding this vision of yourself and knowing that you are going to compare yourself. It's inevitable. But you don't have to stay with that as your only matrix. What you need instead is a better matrix, which just says, who am I envisioning myself as? Mm-hmm. That's lovely, man. I love it. As we come to the end here, I want to ask you, I want to ask you 2 questions. Who is a leader who has really impacted you? Who's a leader you see who's just doing it right?
Great question.
Because we all need inspiration. We all need somebody to hold us to something. We go, that's part of the vision of who I want to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's nobody that you would know.
That's good. Tell us about that. That's fabulous. My favorite.
Yeah, I'd say it's my father. I'd say it's my father. He always modeled the way when it came to ethics, morals, hard work, up early every day, working at a construction site, providing for 4 boys in a town that we couldn't afford to live in. providing us the opportunity to go to college, even though he got his associate's degree at night, late in life, basically gave us a life that he didn't have for himself. And I just find that, it's those leaders that are closest to you that make the biggest difference in your life. And so for me, it's my father and it's people like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, again, coming back to understanding that leadership, I've said for years, if you want to call what leadership is impact. The question is, what impact are you having?
Yeah.
Because if you're the leader who's having the impact that you're actually destroying the family life of somebody you are leading, that's something to look at. You may be a leader who's leading people to all kinds of financial success, but if you're not having emotional success with that person, that's a whole other gig, and it's profoundly important. If you were going to give leaders listening, watching us, and you said, there's one thing I want you to get that's totally practical that I want you to go do in the next 24 hours or at most the next 5 working days, what would be that one practical thing you'd say, go do this, write to me and tell me you did it?
Your people want to feel valued. And that's it. If there's one takeaway, if I can only share one nugget or advice that's been shared with me, is your people want to feel valued. So go back to work tomorrow, the next day, and listen and acknowledge and thank people before you respond. That's it. It's really not much more complicated than that.
So often, and I have had, as you know, so many amazing guests on here, and I feel so blessed to have had them. And, the greatest wisdom is the stuff that is, as I'm trying to remember his last name now, Moshe Feldenkrais said, it's the elusive obvious. Right? It's the elusive obvious. It's right, I'm trying to remember the French for it, but the French is it's under your nose. It's so freaking obvious. But unfortunately, most leaders, very often, not most leaders, but many leaders, refuse to look in the mirror. And you can't see under your nose unless you look in the mirror. And what's under your nose may be really quite gross, and you need to look at it so that you can wipe it away and you can deal with it. But if you don't look in that mirror, you want to keep telling yourself you're a pretty leader. And pretty, I don't mean as in physically beautiful, but you're doing those things, you are going to miss so much. Sal, it's been fantastic having you here, man. I really appreciate it. Please tell our viewers, our listeners, where they can find out more about you, your books, what you offer, all the fabulous resources that you have.
Thank you. Our consulting website is 512solutions.com. It's the number is 512solutions.com. You can find copies of my book, Ignite, Unite, and soon to be coming Stakeholder-Centered Coaching with Marshall Goldsmith. If you're more interested in our technology platform, you can get out to coachmetrix.com. Dov, thank you. It's really been an honor and a pleasure, and I could philosophize with you all night.
Yeah, I think there might be a couple of tequilas involved, and you and I could sit around.
Hey, that'd be even better.
A couple of añejo tequilas. You and I could sit back, and we could definitely get some deep stuff going on. It's been fabulous, my man. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for everything you've shared. And I just want you to know how much I have appreciated it. And I hope you'll stay with us to the end. And to you, dear listener, I want to, again, as always, remind you, don't just listen. Listen again. Go back. Take notes. Pay attention. And look at what you need to do, the action you need to take. And reach out to Sal through, what's the best website to go to get a hold of you to find out more?
Yeah, 512solutions.com.
512solutions.com. Write to Sal. Tell him what you got out of this. Tell him the impact that it's had. And moreover, tell him what you're going to do with it. Because remember, information is with the hole in the donut. Transformation comes from application. Tell him what you're going to do with it, and then go do it, and then tell us both. Write to me. I give you my private email, dov@dovbaron.com. Not complicated. Write to me. Tell me what you've done with what we've shared here. We put the time and the energy in. Sal is not a cheap guy. You're not going to show up for $5. He's given you his time here. He's given you his energy. You know what it would cost to. He's coached you for an hour. Use it. Remember, the research consistently shows that the biggest challenges facing even the most successful companies is somewhat counterintuitive, and that these fast-growing companies often hit a point where they realize they're spending a fortune attracting, training, and developing their talent, only to have them leaving at an alarming rate. If you're sick of investing in the training and development of your talent, only to have them leave you before you've got your ROI, then come talk to us at fullmontyleadership.com, where we provide you with the essential leadership skills to rekindle and amplify the hidden loyalty assets inside your organization by tapping into your purpose. fullmontyleadership.com, providing you with the concrete soft skills to get you and your organization to the top and keep you there. Why? Because you can't outsource authenticity. And also remember, get yourself over to the Matrix, matrix.fullmontyleadership.com, Matrix like the movie, you don't need a www, so just matrix.fullmontyleadership.com and get your self-assessment tool. It'll assess you in the 5 areas of leadership. Absolutely free to you as a listener, valued at $197, matrix.fullmontyleadership.com. I'm your host, Dov Barron, founder of Full Monty Leadership, and I'm here to assist you tapping into your deep greatness so that you can reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, profit in your business, your life, and your leadership. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about the impact of your leadership, not just on the people in front of you, but on that ripple effect that you're having. Be courageous. Be transparent. Look in the mirror. Reach out to Sal. Reach out to me. Till next time, Dov Barron, I am out.